the commonality of what they were doing really well and where they were struggling from that perspective. And that became the beginning of EOS. He started putting all of that together into a process on how, what things are common, what would be a successful company. And that was really the beginnings of EOS. So simply put, the playbook analogy is great. It is a simple business process and tools for entrepreneurs and small business owners to align their teams on their vision. It also allows them and gives them discipline and accountability for their teams to execute really, really well on that vision. And as a result, they get everything they want out of their business. Their teams become more cohesive, working together, and they start to see progress on where they're going.
Yeah.
And that's really sort of the essence of EOS.
Yeah. And I'm excited to talk more about this because obviously I want to learn, we can apply some of these, some of this playbook to our own business. But maybe you can go back a little bit, John, in terms of like, how did you get into becoming an EOS consultant? What did that sort of pathway look like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. My pathway is not the traditional that you would think for someone who's doing EOS. I started with what we'll call a big corporation. I went the corporate path after college and getting a business degree. But the one thing that I found when I look back at my career, even in that arena, I was attracted to companies that were entrepreneurial. And I started my career with a consumer products company in New York area. And we were, think of it as the David and an industry of Goliaths. We were the little guy. We had to be scrappy. We had to out innovate. We had to be more resourceful, faster to market. And I loved that. I mean, that was sort of where I said, this is for me. This is the environment that I want to be in. As I had a career, spent 20 years there and got to experience a lot. Um, but at one point in time, the David grew into the Goliath, and I said, you
Hmm.
know what? I think there's more out there for me. And I really wanted to go to a small organization because, listen, there's nowhere to hide. I mean, entrepreneurs and business owners know when you're in a small company, there's nowhere to hide. Sometimes
Yeah.
in a corporate environment, you can do that. And through networking, I found a business owner who had three businesses, and we were talking about my experience about change and everything that I've learned through that experience. And he handed me this book, Traction by Gino Wickham. And he said, you know what? Read this book, and I'd love you to talk to me about how you could help me implement EOS in my three companies here in Salt Lake City. And I said, you know what? I read the book, and I said it touches on everything that I learned from a big company perspective, but simplifies it. I said, what the hell? Let's go for it. And I spent 5 years with him, putting EOS in each of his three companies. It was really one of the most rewarding experiences I had in my entire career because you could see the vision
Hmm.
start to go into actionable items, and then you could start seeing the results that we were gaining from it. And at the end of it, that journey, I have a passion for helping others, and said I'd love to help other business owners do this, and that's how I came into becoming an EOS implementer.
Awesome. Well, why don't we dive into a little bit about EOS? What
Yeah.
are some of the common challenges business owners face that EOS can help address?
Yeah, it's funny because our target is probably business owners anywhere from 10 to 250 employees is probably our
Okay.
sweet spot. We could talk about, there's possibilities from both sides, but that's generally where it's most effective. A lot of times what we end up finding is, entrepreneurs or business owners, their businesses go through cycles. You start it and then it starts to grow, and then all of a sudden you hit a ceiling or sort of that area where it's hard to get to the next level. Um, where we come in is we're able to help those that are either scaling, they've already launched, and they're at a point where they've hit the ceiling. A lot of times it's an owner who says, you know what, I'm more afraid of the status quo than I am of change, right? Change is really what I believe is going to help me. I'm really afraid that it's not going to get any better or stay the same. And it's generally someone who's open to transparency. I'm going to tell you everything about my business and share that with my team on what I'm doing really, really well. but they're also vulnerable and open to learning and adapting this process and embracing it. That's generally where we end up seeing this being most effective.
So these are your ideal clients. I mean,
Yeah.
if they're open to change, if they're vulnerable, if they they're transparent about their business, it sounds like it could position you to be successful on their behalf.
Yeah. I mean, listen, that helps me be more effective because then I can help the team in their journey and
Yeah.
share what I've learned and use the tools to its most. Um, if you're not willing to, share and be transparent, then your team doesn't really understand where you're going. You can't have those really deep conversations about what we're really doing well and what we're really not doing well and what we have to improve upon. So it's that vulnerability of not only just the company, but you as a person and part of the team.
Yeah. Yeah. So you kind of alluded to this a little bit. Companies 10 to 250 or so employees. Is it too early to ever start talking about EOS or too early to learn about it? Do I need to be feeling a bunch of pain in my operations or my company before I even, start picking up that book traction? Like, when is a good time to start exploring the EOS playbook?
Yeah. So most of the time, we come in when the pain is severe.
Okay.
It could be, I don't feel like I have control of my business. I have no work-life balance. My company's consuming me. We're making money, but I know we can make more. Yeah, like I mentioned before, we're hitting the ceiling, or that just overall feeling of nothing's working is
Yeah.
generally when we have that conversation. But I would say that it's never too early, right? If you know that you're going to go on the growth trajectory and you know that things are going to take off, probably earlier is better for the pain. And what I love about EOS and hopefully we could talk a little bit more about some of the components. Even if you've got to that point where you've just launched it and it's still relatively small, there's lots of good information or components that you can kind of take out of that and start early. We'll
Hmm.
talk about a vision traction organizer where it helps put your vision on paper. Even if that you're that solo entrepreneur who hasn't really brought a team on, it brings you in this mindset of, let me think out into the future. What does that look like? What things have to happen? And then all of a sudden, now you have sort of a roadmap to say, as this grows, I know where I need to be and what do I have to invest in? Where do I have to focus on? When do I have to start bringing people on? So that's a great example of it's probably never too early to look at this. And even if you don't do a full implementation, there's plenty of good information about EOS that can help you early on.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about it. What are some of the
Yeah.
key components to EOS? And um, maybe you can give us an overview on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we start the EOS journey with a client, there's six components that we have an objective to get them 100% strong on, right? And we start the journey by measuring that too. I mean, 100% is great. 80%, if you can get 80% strong in these six components, your business is really going to start to take off from that perspective, and you'll be executing really well. So that's vision, component, people component, data, issues, process, and traction. And maybe if I could just give you a little bit, color behind what does vision mean.
Yeah, that'd be
Um,
helpful.
what we do is we take people through the vision component of what we call a vision traction organizer, and we ask them to answer 8 questions about their vision. What's your core values? What's your culture? What decisions do you make on hiring, firing? What do we want the culture to be, and what's the attributes of people we want to join? And then we want to make sure that you have the transparency that you're going to share that with everyone, shared by all, right? So that everyone understands where you're going and how you're going to get there. On the people side, it's really focusing on right people, right seat. We use an accountability chart to make sure that you have the right structure first, and then we give you simple tools to make sure you have the right person in the right seat from that perspective. And then the third component of that is the data. We do measurables and a scorecard. Everyone in the company at some point in time is going to have a number so that they know how they can measure where they're at. The analogy of a sports team, if you don't know what the score is, you don't know where you're at. We have a very simple scorecard which think about it as almost like a dashboard, red
Yeah.
light, green light, and you review that on a weekly basis to make sure that you're clear on where we are, and the warning signs start early from that perspective. So once you're really strong on that, all of a sudden issues start to come up, right? Because you're really clear on where you're going, you understand what you're doing and well and not well. We give you two tools from the issue side. We create what we call an issues list, right? Let's make sure that we keep track of everything that we have to tackle to remove obstacles and make sure that we get traction on the business. And we give you a simple tool called IDS, identify, discuss, and solve. And what it does is it makes you focus on the root cause of an issue before you go to discuss and solve. And once you have it solved, there's accountability for someone to come back and make sure that it's done. You line up your issues quickly, you knock them down, you analyze what the issue is, and you get it out of the way. Um, then the other component is process, right? For any business to scale, you need to have a consistent, simple process. We make sure that you end up focusing on 20% of your processes that impact 80% of your business. It's not overwhelming SOPs. It's very simple tools to make sure everyone has clarity on what the process is for your business.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last component is traction. And that's where the magic happens. We give you what we call rocks. We break them into 90-day world so that you're always focusing on 90 days at a time, because organizations can't really handle more than a 90-day horizon to get things finished. And then the last is we give you a really good meeting pulse, effective meetings to make sure that right hand and left hand knows what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
and that you can measure your progress from that perspective.
I love this. You know what?
Gino's got a great quote. I love this one, because
Yeah.
when you go through the 6 components, we give you a visual. Vision's on the top and traction's on the bottom. And his quote is, "Vision without traction is an hallucination."
It's appropriate these days.
Yeah.
Um, you know what I love about these 6 is that it seems very, very simple, distinct, compartmentalized, yet they're very intentional, right?
Yeah.
And when you experience something in your business, your startup, your company, it feels like there's an easy way to say, okay, what I'm experiencing or observing can be addressed by looking at one of these 6 topics or areas, right? And it feels like there's I guess, again, going to that word playbook, like there's an approach or a playbook or formula for how to deal and how to address, whether it's a people issue, how to hire people, how to automate processes, for example, how to disseminate and be transparent about vision. It feels very intentional. And it sounds like that's part of the intent is being intentional.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that was sort of that study in the founding that he has, is that these 6 components are the most critical ones that if you focus on them, because they're all interdependent in some
Yeah.
way or another. You're exactly right. I mean, when you talk about accountability, do you have the right people in the right seat? Or do we know what the scorecard is so that we can get an understanding of who's accountable for that?
Yeah.
Right. And if it's off track, who's going to solve it?
Yeah.
That's exactly sort of the beauty of EOS, is that it's that interdependence. And if you get all of them strong, that's when everything starts to really take off.
Yeah. I've been working in recruiting now for 11 years, and we'll go into a company, and it ends up spinning wheels when there isn't that level of, I would say, transparency, alignment, vision, and sort of traceability. So, for example, we'll go in, hiring manager has an idea of what they're looking for,
Yeah.
and they have a job description, or they'll work with us in developing a job description, initially in sort of a silo, and then at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, it gets to the other stakeholders, and they're looking at the job description, or worse, they're looking at candidates that have been procured already for this job description, and they're like, this doesn't align with our vision or culture, what have you. And I'm like, wow, I wish we knew that earlier. And it's like, you won't believe like how many cycles are just spent, because that traceability, that connection between vision and, let's say, for example, in this case, people, they're just not connected, right? And it feels like that's what EOS can bring to the table, is sort of an approach, an operating system, right, for connecting some of those dots. And maybe you could talk. Oh, go ahead, John. You were
Yeah,
going to say
well,
something?
think about that. I mean, as the entrepreneur who starts with an idea, it's one person. All of a sudden, you say, "Okay, I need somebody else to help me, right? I can't do it all myself."
Yeah.
So then you bring the second person on, and then the third. But with three people, two or three people, everyone's got to do everything, right? And the entrepreneur who's a starter is probably doing almost all of it because it was his idea. And then all of a sudden you realize and you look around and we have like 10 people here and you know everyone's pitching in and probably want to see success in the organization, but there was never really clarity. It's funny, it's so a client I just had, part of the EOS journey is what we do is something called an accountability chart. And what we intentionally do is to say, step back. Okay, you've got 10 people already, but everybody, remove yourself from the seat. I'm going to fire you for 10 minutes here, right? As we go through this journey, let's look at what's the right structure, not organization, the right structure for where we are today. And we're not going to put titles, but we're going to put functions to have a little bit more clarity. And then every function, we're going to give 3 to 5 bullets on what are they accountable for.
Yeah.
And then what you're doing is removing the history of who came in when and what they actually were doing. But what do we need? And then you start to bring people back in and say, okay, we have clarity on the role. Do you get it? Do you want it? And do you have the capacity? And we basically rehire that
Yeah.
individual. And so now you make sure that number one, you have the right structure, but you'll have clarity to make sure they're in the role that best fits them.
Yeah.
And that's when you have more clarity on, the example that you gave is sort of, it just happened. We know we need help, but let's go get somebody and fill it, and get a recruiter to help us. This is sort of stepping back and making sure that you have clarity. And what I did is one of the groups that I had is once you get really good about that accountability chart, you can start looking into the future and say, okay, let's just project out, on the VTO, we're going to do a 3-year plan. Let's take a shot at what the organization's going to look like in 3 years, or the structure, the accountability chart. And then all of a sudden you have a roadmap to say, who's my team now? What skills are they going to have to develop over the next 3 years to make sure that they're really going to be in one of these seats?
Yeah.
And where do we may need to look at, outside resources or new people to help us on our journey? So that's a perfect example of one of the ways that EOS can help.
Yeah. No, I love it. I've dealt with a lot of startups, early stage, looking for product market fit, post product market fit, sort of growth stage. And, one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of times there is a longing for a more defined process. But on the other hand, there's this sort of stigma that following a process, like the process is kind of a bad word,
It's
you know?
controlling, right?
Yeah. And it's like, it's going to constrain me. It's going to constrain my ability to move fast and to break stuff and to, experiment. Like, can you talk to that a little bit? Because I think, some of our audience out there are maybe thinking about EOS, but they might also be like a little bit reluctant that this might constrain them either in the short term or maybe even
Yeah,
the long term. And
yeah.
how what are your thoughts on that for that entrepreneur out there that's like, okay, we just need to figure stuff out. I don't have time for process.
Yeah.
Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And listen, we hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about the visionary integrator role because that plays into it. But
Yeah.
the entrepreneur is really that person that's looking out there. They want to get things done quickly, has a new idea every morning. But when you think about that, to start to scale a business, you need to have a repeatable process. And what EOS does is it realizes that you're working with companies in that stage of growth or 10 to 250. We only do enough process to make sure that there's clarity on it can be repeated, right?
Hmm.
And just more clarity. It's not a full SOP with, dozens of lines of every aspect. It's just enough to make sure that we have clarity that if that seat opens up, you can hand somebody a half a page or a full page of this is our process, and there's enough there that someone can figure it out without constraining them. That's the beauty of I think in my mind, EOS is it. The EOS doesn't overwhelm the company. It adjusts or allows the company to use it to be more effective.
Yeah. Yeah. It also sounds like it defines sort of an interface for how people can interact with each other, what they can rely on from other folks. It establishes some sort of cadence for how meetings should be conducted, how communication can be
Yeah.
most effective. So it feels like a pretty comprehensive playbook. What are some common misconceptions about EOS, and how do you address that with your clients or even potential
Yeah.
clients?
Yeah, so I mean that's a lot of the discussion that I have when I talk about EOS. Oh, so is that a software system, or is that an HR system, or
Yeah.
is that an accounting system? So it's interesting that the conception is that, or the other thing is, well, is this a seminar that you do, and you teach us how to do it? Um, those are some of the misconceptions, but it is a business process that could be used at any industry. It's just following a playbook, like you said, the analogy of that playbook of you have your business, and some of the misconception is when I come in, I'm going to give them advice on how to increase the value of their company. I don't know enough about, I'm working with a bakery right now. I know how to eat bakery goods, but I don't know how to make them. um, and so what we find is that 90% of the knowledge and the experience is in the room. What we do is we provide an ability for someone who knows EOS to coach, to facilitate, and help them on their journey. But basically, the answers are all there. I mean, I like to joke, if you don't have a great product or you don't have a great service, I can make you really good at executing on it, but I can't make your product or service any better from my perspective. So, I'd love to. I mean, listen, I'd have tons of clients if I had that answer of both, but um, that's not what EOS is all about.
No, but I love it. It feels like, the role that you play as an EOS consultant and implementer is, bringing this framework that allows the talent in the room to really mine and access their insights and capabilities, and sort of bring that together, as a team, right? That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the majority of the time, every answer that needs to be addressed is in the room.
Yeah.
What they don't necessarily always have is that format and that structure to bring that out and
Yeah.
fully utilize everybody in the room, to problem solve. And when you walk into that room and I facilitate a group, titles, ownership, history, service, how long you've been there, all that stuff is out. Everyone in that room's got an equal voice,
Yeah.
to participate. And that's sort of that, and when I engage to say, listen, this is the way that we're going to operate. It's got to be open, honest communication in this room. We got to leave our egos at the doorway. Otherwise, we're never going to really accomplish what we need to. No politics, get it out there. And it's going to be sometimes painful to have some of these conversations because we're talking about discipline and accountability. But if you truly, truly, truly want to improve, those are the things that you got to have to get over.
It feels like there's a little bit of a cultural prerequisite for EOS to be implemented successfully. I mean, some of the things, which you might think are just basic, healthy sort of attributes, but of transparency, honesty, um, putting your ego aside, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And without some of those prerequisite cultural uh, characteristics, I guess, um, they might have other things that might need to work on first,
yeah.
right? Before. Um, but
Well, part of what we do in that journey is we measure team health, right? Because
yeah,
early on, when you asked me about what EOS was about, I said it was creating cohesive teams that work together well. What we'll also do is measure how are we functioning as a team. We'll do a health check in the beginning to try to do some honesty about communication,
yeah,
transparency, accountability, and through the journey, we'll go back and say, okay, listen, we're into this for a year. We're going to go back and reassess ourselves. Are we healthier as a team? Let's talk about why we are or not,
yeah,
progressing in certain areas. And that takes the courage. I put up before we start courage and vulnerability. It takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable and say either I don't know or I need help or this isn't working or I have the courage to say, listen, I don't think you're holding up your end of the bargain. And that's what happens as we start to go through this journey and teams come together.
Yeah. I could see that whole, I could imagine that whole experience, you in this room full of leaders with a given company, and it being quite almost like a therapy session where, yours people maybe might be airing grievances, but it feels like it could be very, at least initially, very cathartic, getting people on the same page and giving them a chance to be transparent, to say what they need to say. And I don't know, is that is that a fair
Yeah,
sort of presumption?
it was interesting. So the journey that I had internally, and what I love about it, or I believe my experience is unique, is I got to live it from the inside and
Yeah,
experience. So I know what happens when your implementer leaves. And listen, on day one, the team is not always healthy. And there's different degrees of it. But what was really great about that experience is as we went through this journey, you could see the team getting stronger and stronger. And all of a sudden, this burden taken off of the owner of having to own anyone because everyone became more engaged, healthier conversations. It was easier to confront difficult situations and solve them because the team started to trust each other.
yeah,
They saw the alignment, they saw where we were going. You could see where you had the impact and what your part was of that. And everyone really started to share and become more of a cohesive team when you start to get there. But it doesn't happen. Rarely does it happen on day one. This
yeah.
journey kind of helps you get there from that.
I mean, how long does it take to get how long does it take to get EOS implemented for a given company? I know that's sort of a loaded question because I'm sure it depends.
Yeah.
But what does it depend on, and what does that time frame look like where a team can transition from, let's just say, a moderately dysfunctional team, or to a team that's performing sort of in cadence and in
Yeah.
stride, in
Yeah.
flow?
Yeah.
What does that look
Well,
like?
let me do this. Let me describe the EOS process first,
Sure.
because that would help sort of give an understanding of where do you get and when do you go there, and sort of the role of the EOS implementer.
Okay.
So every engagement we start with a 90-minute meeting, and we call it a 90-minute meeting because we spend 90 minutes with the leadership team, and that's when we basically cover everything about EOS. We uncover everything, and I share all the aspects and components in the process of EOS, so that the key component there is I want to engage with a company that says, I know enough about EOS, or you've taught me everything that's in there. This is right for us, and I want to work with you. And the beauty of what I love about EOS is that you don't have to commit. You could even start to self-implement after that 90-minute meeting. Where I add value is you say, I'd like to have a guide or a Sherpa, to kind
Yeah.
of guide me through this journey. And that's how we start. And so the next step is if you decide EOS is right for you, we call it a focus day. And you would think, okay, it's about learning the tools or gaining traction first, right? So we teach you the accountability chart and make sure you have the right structure. We teach you how to set rocks or goals for the next 90-day. We create your scorecard so that you have measurables. And then I teach you how to have a really good meeting. And you would think, okay, maybe you start with that vision piece first, but it's good for teams to get practice on gaining traction and getting things done and starting operating as a team. And that's why we do focus day first. We come back in another 30 days after you have practice, and that's when we start vision building. And
Okay.
that's filling out the 8 questions of the vision traction organizer. And it's a hefty process. So we break it into 2 days. One day to get started, but we also say, are you getting better at having your meetings? Are you accomplishing your goals? We come back in another 30 days, complete vision building. And so that you have a clear roadmap. Now you've gotten some practice on gaining traction. And that's when we get into this cycle of we live in a 90-day world. Every quarter you come back and you measure, what are we accomplishing? What's done? Look at your scorecard, reset new goals or rocks for the next 90-day, and you basically become into a 90-day world after that. Then at an annual time, you get a 2-day reset to say, let's look back. What did we accomplish? And let's look forward to the next year and do a check on how are we getting close to our 3-year plan? Are we still committed to our mission? Um, are we living our core values? And then after that period of time, basically every 90 days, you're going back into the same world, the same cycle. And so my job is to get you to that point where you're doing your 90-day meetings. What I love about EOS is at some point in time, anywhere from a year and a half to 2 years, you should be good enough to do this without an implementer.
Mm-hmm.
And what I love about it is it doesn't create this reliance on your implementer to be the key to your success. You can go on your own. Now, if you decide and you love your implementer and want to bring them back every 90 days, really it's a luxury. Or if you love to have a facilitator and have them on your journey. But I like that we don't create the dependence
Yeah.
on someone coming in from that perspective.
Teaching them to fish.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the philosophy of giving and teaching and allowing companies to really use this on their own.
This exercise of the vision, you mentioned those 8 questions. Is that done with the entire leadership team, or is it
Yeah,
just the founder?
yeah.
Okay.
So everything that I described is done at first with the entire leadership team. But once you get into that 90-day world, all of a sudden, if the organization is big enough, you start cascading these meetings, the L10 meetings, the rocks, and you share the vision traction organizer with the entire organization. So you have this cascading of measurables, accountability, and rocks so that the entire
Mm-hmm.
organization knows exactly where we're going
Yeah.
and how does my number, and everyone has a number in the organization at some point in time through this journey, so that there's a level of accountability and clarity on the roles and what we're going against, and we can measure it. And then you share every quarter what our progress was, what we accomplished, what we didn't accomplish,
Mm-hmm.
and what we're going to do next quarter. So
Okay.
that's where you start to get an entire alignment with the entire organization.
Yeah. Um, and as far as its applicability to different industries, how would you comment on that? Like, is this mostly for tech companies, or it could? I mean, you mentioned a bakery. Like,
Yeah.
what companies is this most suited for versus not?
Yeah, it can work with any company. I mean, it
Okay.
really is, if you have a vision, you want to gain traction and you want to bring your team along, it could be done in any organization. It really doesn't make a difference. We have
Okay.
tons of examples of we'll work with nonprofits. I mean, we'll work with tech companies, consumer products. I mean, trades. Our, it's applicable, and we work with many, many, many different companies.
Okay. And then talk a little bit about the visionary and the integrator roles.
Yeah.
And what makes them distinct? How do you characterize them? What are they responsible for? What does that look like?
Yeah. So if you think about the entrepreneur who starts, that's typically your visionary. They have this idea, they know where they're going in their mind, they can see where it is and where it's going from that perspective. A lot of times they have 1,000, ideas on where to go and how to, what's the next innovation. They're the product person, the service person, they're sort of out there out front. But a lot of times they're not really, really good at the accountability, making sure the trains are running on time, doing the
Mm-hmm.
coordination and the process. So there's two distinct roles in EOS, the visionary role and the integrator. You think about it, they're almost the yin and the yang,
Yeah.
from that perspective. This is the person who's out front with the big ideas and is really great about looking forward. The integrator role complements them because they're the ones who basically keep the trains on schedule. They're really great about keeping accountable on what they're doing and what they're accomplishing. They like to measure where you're at. And so that team, when they're working really, really well together, is really rocket fuel for the organization.
Okay. Um, you talked a little bit about the EOS approach, the 90-day iteration cycles. Um, Generally speaking, how long does it take for a given company to kind of start seeing results? And what do those results often start to look like? How do they start to manifest themselves? I mean, you mentioned a health check. But does it start
Yeah,
there? Is
yeah.
that is that where a lot of the results are seen initially?
Well, I mean, as I described in the process, we teach traction first.
Yeah.
So as soon as you have your first meeting with EOS, you're going to start seeing some results. Maybe not dramatic because you've already created a scorecard. You're starting measuring. So 2 to 3 weeks in, you should start giving some indication of we're measuring things and seeing how well we're doing. So you could start seeing results immediately. Now, transformative, results really come probably after you get into your 90-day world. And then all of a sudden you start to see big chunks of, making progress on where the vision was because you have an annual plan and you
Hmm.
have a quarterly measurement. That's really where you start to see that, big impact and big results.
Okay. And then, is there a certain momentum or cadence that companies start to see, or do they start to plateau at some point? How can they ensure that, they'll keep
Yeah.
sort of improving?
Yeah. It really depends on the team and the motivation of the team. And a lot of what happens is as you start to see progress, the motivation starts to increase, right? Because you have a clear roadmap. You start to see that you're accomplishing things. Uh, One watch out that I'll give, and even through personal experience of living it on the inside, is teams get excited about you're doing EOS, we're making progress, we
Yeah.
all have goals and a scorecard, and they generally bite too much off. We try to preach simplicity and work on the most important things first that give you the biggest results. And that sometimes takes some discipline because just human nature is, we want to accomplish everything. I want to get everything done next week.
Yeah.
Um, so my caution on momentum is make sure you keep it, start slow, start small, things that you can obtain first. And then as you get really good at it, it gets easier and easier to add more from your problem solving, your issues list, and things that you teach through that.
To be
I'll tell
patient.
you, yeah, one thing I did learn was, and this is through experience of even before EOS, is when you are in the environment together, it's very easy to excuse things for not getting done because everyone's really working hard, and you know what they have on your plate, and there's always something that comes up that distracts you. Having an implementer come in periodically or every quarter, where at a team meeting you have to report out, here are the rocks or the goals that I had for the last 90 day. How many of those did I accomplish? 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 4. All of a sudden, the accountability starts to increase because I have a point in time where I know it has to get done.
Hmm.
Having somebody from the inside actually increases that level of accountability or focus on making sure you get things done. And
Yeah.
that was what part of my experience, until you get really good at it and that discipline is built in. Having somebody from the outside doing a check-in really makes sure that there's a high level of accountability as you're on this journey.
What advice, John, would you give to either a leadership team or somebody that's not part of the leadership team that is listening to this and they're like, wow, I'd love it if our company could implement something like this because I see all kinds of sort of wasted cycles and energy and focus. Like if they're not part of the leadership team, how can they either champion this? Does it have to be championed from the top down? In other words, um,
It, it, there has to be whoever's the decision maker has to buy in and own this. And yes, I've had lots of conversation with people who said, my boss really needs this, or our company really needs this, and it may be true, but it has to be to the point where the person who is either the entrepreneur or the owner also agrees that I need help. Otherwise, it's not that full commitment or that vulnerability or sort of that acceptance or embracing the process. The owner and the entire leadership team, it works both ways too. I mean, you can have an owner who says, listen, I want to do this, but a team that's not fully bought in. It works
yeah,
both. Um, but for this to really work, the decision maker or someone who's driving the organization has to embrace and want to do this.
yeah, yeah, um, yeah. Because I can see that there's a lot of companies out there that they probably have team members where they're like, wow, we're spending there's so many inefficiencies here, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of opportunities to kind of bring everybody to the same page. EOS could be a solution here. Um, would you recommend that person sort of share EOS with their leadership as an option?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's tons of I can I'm happy to give and teach and share with anyone who wants to learn more about this,
Yeah.
and give enough that they can give a preview to the decision maker to introduce the idea of EOS. And then the next step would be to meet with that individual to make sure that they're clear on what it is.
Okay.
And then you can move into the 90-minute. Yeah.
And for that early stage startup or even growth stage startup that is struggling with some of the pains that you described early on here in our conversation, what is the alternative if they don't implement something like this? Is it just to kind of try to innovate their own in-house proprietary op- operating system, or is it just to kind of tolerate, some of these pains that they might be enduring?
Yeah,
Um,
it's interesting because sometimes from a startup, they're really bright people
yeah.
and they know a lot. The question is it easier to take somebody else's great idea and use it versus trying to create your own? And that's generally the situation that you're at. But what I think the beauty of it is, even if you're to the point where a full implementation doesn't work for you, for early startup, you can use the vision traction organizer with a couple of people just to make sure you have clarity between everybody who's there on what the roadmap looks like.
Hmm.
And you can clearly measure at any time where you're at. And even use simple tools like I talked about IDS. You don't have to have a full L10 meeting, which we call our, just to say, here's a simple tool for us to discuss on how to solve problems together on a one-on-one basis. We identify, we get to the root cause, we discuss quickly and come to a solve and make sure it's clear on who solves that problem and when they solve it.
Yeah.
So that's just maybe two examples of you can use pieces of EOS before you get to that point where you're scaling and have a team just to bring,
So that's
traction, before a full implementation. So,
so
and that gets you sort of ready of that discipline of, okay, now I've gotten to that point where I'm ready for a full implementation because I have enough of a team. You've already got some of the components, up and running.
the vision. So you mentioned the vision traction organizer, and what was
Yeah.
the other one?
It's just the simple tools of creating an issues list.
Okay. Yeah.
Every
So
time we meet, make sure we have a list of everything that's an issue that we have to solve. And the IDS is a quick way to make sure that you get to the root of the problem and solve it.
IDS. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. What does IDS stand for?
Identify, discuss, and solve.
Okay. So those could be sort of two simple on ramps for somebody looking to learn more about EOS and looking for a quick way to get started. It sounds like EOS is a pretty comprehensive playbook, framework, operating system, but it doesn't need to be entirely integrated for to realize any value. You could start realizing value very quickly.
Yeah, yeah. If you're early startup and don't have enough people that you're going to have an effective quarterly meeting and have to
Yeah.
have a full, there's just pieces that you can use to get you good practice, and it prepares you for that. Once you're then ready and you've scaled, it's that proactive piece to say, okay, now I do have 10 or 15 employees. It's time for us to really think about, do we want to implement? But you've gotten used to some of the things and the terminology and the language in EOS.
Yeah. And one thing I was just thinking about here, John, is it feels like EOS is a great operating system or playbook for sort of seeking alignment, communication, transparency, disseminating vision within the organization. What are some of the benefits of implementing EOS as it pertains to how the company leadership might communicate, or how it might communicate with investors? Let's say, for example. Um,
Yeah, so it's interesting. I had that discussion with an owner because part of it is investors want to understand, do you have a playbook or sort of what's the vision, where you're going and what does that look like,
mhm.
right? Because at some point in time, I want to look at the current value of you're at. I also want to look at what the future value is going to be. EOS gives them a really easy way to explain, here's where we are today. This is where we're going to go in the future, and this is what we're going to do. It also helps them from here's the resources and investment that we need to get there. Because when you do your 3-year plan, you're really getting a little bit more specific about technology, resources, people,
Yeah.
scope, investment. And that would give an investor really clear, or you would give confidence to an investor that I have a really clear roadmap.
Yeah.
The other aspect is that you prove that we have a process internally to accomplish that and make sure that we get there. And I can tell you at any point in time during the journey exactly where we're at, because we have checkpoints at a 90-day process and an annual basis, and telling you where we are from the 3-year plan, which then gets adjusted periodically to say, is our 10-year vision really clear and achievable from that perspective? You've also done an outline on the VTO of what's our marketing strategy, who's our target consumer, what our 3 uniques are, do we offer guarantees? So, I mean, there's lots of great information in there that you would talk to an investor about to say, we've thought all of it out. We've laid it
Yeah.
out. We have a plan of where we're going. And you can then understand that. So if you want to invest in my company, I've opened up the covers and told you exactly where we're going to go, how we're going to get there, and I have a tool to make sure that we're getting there as we go,
Yeah.
so that there's
Yeah.
no uncertainty.
It's interesting because I've worked with a lot of startups, and every quarter or biannually, I see this scramble of, oh, we have a board, we have a meeting with our investors. Let's start collecting all this data and put this deck together. But it sounds like some of these processes are already integrated in the day to day, week to week of EOS. And would that mitigate some of that scramble for some of these companies?
Absolutely. I mean, because as we talked about, you have a scorecard that you're measuring every week, which gets you closer to your 90-day goal.
Yeah.
You end up measuring it, and so at any point in time, I think the benefit of it is that there wouldn't be surprises when you're meeting with investors, because you knew what's going off track early enough that you can make corrections.
Yeah.
And so you wouldn't be scrambling at the last minute before your investor meeting to say, did we meet our number? You're going to know very early on whether we're going to make it or not. And you can do things to fix it. Now, listen, if you don't, you can at least inform you, or your investors would know early enough so that it's not a real surprise when you have that discussion at the
Yeah.
meeting that things were sort of on track. But then you have some understanding, because when it's off track, you have to solve that problem or dig deep into the root cause.
Yeah.
And you can clearly explain, here's what happened and why, and the
Yeah.
root cause of the issue, and what we did to try to solve it. And whether it gets solved or not, you've gone through this intensive process of saying, we knew about it, we addressed it, and here's the result of what happened from that
Yeah.
perspective. Maybe we had a bad goal or too ambitious, but here's what we did and why. And I think that instills a lot of confidence from an investor standpoint, because you really feel like you have control of your business. You understand your business from a very detailed business perspective and why.
Yeah. Implicit in the operating system is traceability, right?
Yeah,
And so when you're talking with your investors, and if you fell short of an objective, or then the next question is why? What's the root cause?
yeah,
And what are you going to do about it? That's what they want to know,
yeah,
right? Do you have
yeah,
a plan to do something about it? And the traceability, it feels like it allows you to speak intelligently about, um, cause and effect. Like, what are the root cause? And having a handle on that is, what the investors want to see, right?
yeah, yeah. And investors would end up understanding your roadmap and have some input on, I agree where we're going, and it seems to be a common goal. We see the same vision, or we're bought into where you're going from that perspective because you shared all the details.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. John, this has been awesome to kind of give me a sense, and our listeners a sense of EOS, how they can start to learn more about it and integrate it into their own companies, and what they might be missing out on if they're spending, undue cycles trying to invent their own operating system and playbook. What are some any sort of parting recommendations to our audience, um, ways that they can connect with you and sort of learn more about EOS?
Yeah, so I mean, hopefully it came across as that I'm really, really passionate about EOS. I mean, I think it's great, it works, and that passion is giving and sharing. So if you want to learn more about it, reach out to me. I'd love to spend a couple of minutes with you talking a little bit about EOS, whether we work together or not. The more that we have people understand what it is and what it's all about, it's better for the community overall from that perspective. So go out to eosworldwide.com. There's tons of great information out there. If you want to explore it yourself, it's out there. If you want to contact me, I'm at EOS Worldwide /John-Annunziata.com. Link to my homepage, make a connection, and I'd love to share a little bit more with you.
Awesome. And we'll put that in the show notes for the audience out there.
Super.
John, it's been a pleasure. I'm looking forward to observing and being a part of your journey as you share this wonderful framework with a lot of the companies, entrepreneurs, startups out there. And I know for myself, I'm excited to learn more and look at ways that we can integrate this into our own business. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's been a lot of fun. Appreciate it.